Hello and welcome to today's webinar from Lund to Global Climate Action, Lessons from COP29 Climate Negotiations. My name is Karen Paulson and I work with alumni relations here at Lund University. I will soon be handing over the floor to Ana Maria Vargas Fala, who will be moderating tonight's panel discussion. But before I do so, I wanted to go over a few practical items for this webinar. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. You'll see a little button on the bottom of your screen. And following the discussion today, we'll save the last 10 minutes or so to answer questions that roll in. And you can also upvote questions. So if there's a question that somebody's asked, same question you have, or there's a question that you really, really want to hear the answer to, you can upvote it. And we also have a few colleagues who are sitting behind the scenes who can also help type some answers to questions that come in as well during the webinar. And if you sent in questions ahead of time, we've also taken those into consideration when preparing for today's discussion. So probably several of those will also get answered. As you may have realized, we are also recording this webinar and we'll be sending out an email tomorrow that will also include a link to this recording. And as a quick reminder for those of you watching today who are alumni, we'd like to remind you to log into your alumni profiles at alumni.lu.se and make sure your details are up to date. And for those of you who maybe aren't members yet, we'd love to encourage you to join the alumni network. Membership is free, and it's a great way to get updates from Lund University and about other future alumni activities and events such as this one. And also members get some exclusive discounts and offers. And those of you who are students tuning in, we'd like to remind you also to keep an eye out on the Career Hub for other future career-related activities and events. So yeah, without further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to Ana Maria, and she will present our panelists for tonight.
Thank you, Karen, and hello, everybody. My name is Ana Maria Vargas. I'm a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology of Law here at Lund University, and I had the great privilege to attend the COP climate meeting in Baku, Azerbaijan last week. And I would also be moderating this panel. We have more than 500 participants that registered for today's panel from all over the world. And this is an important sign of how climate action is an important topic that unites us all. So we are very excited to be here and to share the reflections from 3 participants that have a unique characteristic in common. They all studied here at Lund University and they all participated in the negotiations. So we will go into some of the issues that happened at the COP29 meeting in Baku. We will learn a little bit about what is this climate meeting, how does it work in practice, but we will go in deep into their stories about how they end up there, how's their relation with what they learned here at Lund University, and we would also have time at the end for your questions. So without more words, let's introduce our 3 panelists, and I'm going to invite them to put their cameras on so you can see them. We're going to start with you telling us your name and what was your role at COP29 and how you end up working with climate policies. So let's start with you, Christofer.
Sure, thank you very much. Really nice to be here. So indeed, my name is Christofer Ahlgren, and I studied environmental science at Lund University from 2011 until 2014. And today I'm a policy officer at the European Commission here in Brussels in Belgium, and I work for what is called the Directorate-General for Climate Action, and essentially it's the climate ministry of the EU. And as part of my job, I follow the negotiations on COP related to technology development and transfer, so things related to climate technology. And essentially how I ended up working on this really started from my studies at Lund on environmental policy. And when I finished university, I worked for a couple of years as an environmental consultant specializing in climate change. And yeah, so it's just been continuing to work on climate change ever since I finished studying.
Thank you, Christofer. Kajsa, what about you? Please introduce yourself. Tell us what was your role at COP29 and how did you end up in this career?
Thank you very much and very happy to be here. So my name is Kajsa Nåtby. My role at COP was that I worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Sweden, and I followed the negotiations on climate finance. So in particular, the negotiations around this new goal of climate finance that was agreed at the COP. And my kind of journey to working with climate change was that I decided when I think it was around 12 years old when we learned about climate change in school, and then I decided this is what I want to do with my life. And since then, I kind of worked towards that goal. And a part of that was studying in Lund, where I studied political science and economics and also a bit of engineering.
Thank you. And Juichi, it's now your turn. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your role and how you ended up in this work.
Hi, my name is Yuichi Tsuchibuchi. I'm currently based in Japan, and I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Tokyo. And I'm a fresh alumni, I would say, because I was doing my master's in environmental studies and sustainability science. The program is called LUMIS, and I finished my master's just 1 year ago, June 2023. And then after that, I studied University of Tokyo starting from past April this year. And my role at the COP29 was to join as a student representative. And I was also a speaker of the event co-hosted by the University of Tokyo and also Ministry of Environment of Japan. And I was also a youth delegate from GAUC, which is the abbreviation of Global Alliance of Universities on Climate.
Thank you, Juichi. Well, so we are talking here about the COP meeting, but when I was on the way to this panel, I talked to a colleague and he asked me, but what is the COP actually? He had no idea what the COP was. So many of us that work in this field feel like everybody knows what's happening at the global level, but it's not true. Actually, this is something that is very special, unique, and not everybody knows. I want to give the word first to you, Kajsa. You are from all the panelists, the one that has attended most COPs, 7 in total, and you look very young, so we wonder if you started attending when you were 12. But tell us, what is the COP?
So the COP is actually consists of several meetings, but we tend to call them for the COP. And it's the meetings where parties to the UN Climate Convention, parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and parties to the Paris Agreement meet and discuss these agreements. We discuss how we implement them, how we follow up on them, and if there's anything more we need to do, then it's what's already included in these agreements. So all of these agreements are global climate agreements, where depending on which agreement, but most countries of the world are part of those agreements. And we come together to discuss how to globally tackle climate change together. So that would be my brief summary of what the COP is all about. And it's kind of usually tens of thousands of people attending these COPs and participating in these negotiations, or just listening to them, or doing other types of climate-related events in relation to the COPs.
Thank you, Kajsa. Christofer, what about you? What does the COP mean to you and for the European Union? It has a big role, so tell us what the COP is to you.
I think it's a good question. I mean, overall, I think the whole UNFCCC process and the COP really is an incredible opportunity of really seeing multilateralism in action, with really representatives from essentially every country in the world, but also different civil society organizations, business community, being in one place at the same time to talk about sustainability and climate change. And I think the role and the scope of the COP is something that has really evolved over time in the last couple of years. I think the one in Dubai last year was the biggest one, the biggest COP to date, with I think 80,000 people or something in total. But it's really interesting to see how different organizations engage with the negotiations, like what Kajsa mentioned. And really, it's about having everyone represented, giving everyone a voice and a participation in perhaps the biggest and most defining question of our life, of our generations. And one interesting thing that also connected to what Kajsa mentioned with this being the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So as part of knowing where the COP takes place, so there's one COP every year, and the location of it is determined based on different regions of the UN, and who gets to host the COP rotates between these different regions. So that's why 2 years ago it was in Africa, so it was in Egypt, and then it was in the Middle East, so that's why it was in Dubai, and then recently now that it was in Azerbaijan, and the next one will be in Latin America. So it's interesting to see how all countries in the world are engaged and activated and participated in the UN process.
Thank you, Christopher. Those are really interesting facts about what's happening there, how many people attend, how it rotates. I want to give you the word, Yuichi, now to tell us, it was your first COP, was my first COP as well. What are your impressions? And tell us a little bit more about what's happening behind the scenes and some fun facts about like what happens there.
Yeah, so so it was my first time to attend the COP, and to be honest, like it was very like overwhelming. I didn't join from the beginning, but I joined from the second half of the first week. So I maybe like overall attended for like 10 days in total. But like luckily, like what I appreciated about the venue was that some of the organization like made a space to do like, for example, like meditation, or like to create a space where people can just share their like emotions or like experiences during the COP. I think that actually helped me to process the feelings and share my like emotion to other participants, and mostly with like youth members, like youth delegate. I think like even though like we as a youth or like a student had the opportunity to do something at the COP, like we still had like a limitation in terms of, you know, like having access to negotiation room. So in that sense, like it was kind of difficult to be updated with like what's actually happening at the COP. So yeah, but by having like these kind of like space actually helped me to just like release my feelings during the COP.
Thank you. So even meditation, and I have to express, I wish I would attend one of those meditations at the COP meetings, because as you said, it's overwhelming. 50,000 people in the same place, all interested in climate action. So it's almost hard to digest. Thanks so much for sharing these personal insights. We want to move into some of the key questions. So as most people know, this meeting, this COP, was about finances. One of the issues on the agenda was to set up a financial goal on how much wealthier nations like Sweden or Japan were going to give to support vulnerable countries in adapting to climate impacts and transitioning to sustainable energy, addressing both historical responsibility and global equity. So that was one of the main goals of this COP. And we have these cards to be a little bit interactive. So I want to ask the three of you, do you feel hopeful about the new climate finance goals set up at COP29? So we start with whether you feel happy about the result or sad. Okay, so we have two happy faces and one so-so. Let's start with the happy faces. Kajsa, why are you happy?
I'm happy that we managed to agree to a goal. I think that all countries in the world could come together despite kind of the current geopolitical situation. Everyone comes together, finds an agreement on this goal. And even if not everyone is happy, I would say everyone is equally unhappy with the result. And that is usually when you have the kind of best outcomes, when everyone has been having to compromise. And I think the goal that was set was, in a sense, it was this kind of call on all actors to enable investments of $1.3 trillion to developing countries, which is a high and ambitious goal. And then there was a specific goal directed to countries to mobilize climate finance to developing countries of at least 300 billion. So that is 3 times more than the current 100 billion goal. And while many say that is not as ambitious as it should, or it's not as much money as it's needed, it's still a significant increase. And I would argue that it's a ambitious but also realistic goal. And I think we need to have a goal that is realistic so we actually can meet it, because if it's not met, that's going to kind of undermine the whole trust of the negotiations and the Paris Agreement. So I think it's good that we got a goal, that we got an agreement, and that it's ambitious, but also yet something that is achievable and realistic in the current landscape.
Thank you. Christofer, you're also positive about the results. Can you share why?
Yes, indeed, I agree with Kajsa and really think that this is a step in the right direction, really going from the previous financial target that was $100 billion per year, and to increase that 3 times to 300 billion really is definitely the direction that we should be going towards, and also to see how we bring in the multilateral development banks as part of to contribute to this. But I think one thing that is also really good to know about as academics, as students, and the people that are engaged and interested in the whole climate discussion is also that I mean, money doesn't spend itself either. It's also like you need to put in place all the institutions to really make these kind of financial transfers possible. And it doesn't matter if it's in the case of the European Commission or development agencies like SIDA in Sweden or the Japanese International Cooperation Agency. That, I mean, you can't just tell them now send 3 times as much money to developing countries, but it's really, you need maybe 3 times as many project managers. You need 3 times as many lawyers to check the paperwork. You need 3 times as many auditors to do all the evaluations of all the projects that you do. And I think that a little bit helps to explain why it takes time as well, that you're not going to go from 100 billion to 300 billion in one day or in 1 year, but it's about empowering and putting into place the institutions and recruiting the people that are going to be able to do this kind of international collaboration projects. And ultimately, the last thing that I wanted to mention is also really now we need that discussion of how do we go from the billions that we have been talking about now for the last 10 years to the trillions. And here really a big elephant in the room is what we agreed through the Paris Agreement with Article 21C. So that is about how can we make sure that all the financial flows are aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So that means any investment that you have in the stock exchange, your personal retirement funds, that all of those financial transactions should contribute to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And this is something that we are really trying to push from our side in the EU of how can we get the private sector to contribute even more, and how can we make sure that it becomes as expensive as possible to find investments if you want to build a coal power plant. We want it to really make sure that it pays off to build renewable energy power plants instead. And that is something where if we want to go from the billions to the trillions, it's not only about public grants from developed to developing countries, but we really need to make sure that the private sector is also contributing.
Thank you, Christofer. And I will give you the word in a second, Kajsa. But Juichi, you put both signs, positive and happy and sad. Can you tell us why? And maybe focus on the sad, since we heard now the 2 positive stories. We can't hear you. Sorry, you're muted.
All right. The reason why I raised both signs was that one thing is, other speakers mentioned that it was, I would say, a good that we were actually able to finalize the document, because the meeting itself was supposed to finish last Friday, 22nd, but you actually extended for another 2 days. So you actually finished maybe 5 a.m. on Sunday, 24th. And just the day before, it was supposed to be finalized. Well, I guess it was 21st. There was a press conference happening, and then most of the speakers were, I would say, coming from Global South. And then I think it was exactly the day before the document was supposed to be finalized, they were basically saying that like no deal is better than a bad deal because the initial document, the amount of the goal, like climate finance goal, like initially put it in the document was 250 billion US dollars by 2035. And just by like joining several like events organized by by like delegate from Global South, I also felt that the amount is actually not enough. Like it's not like sufficient. So in that sense, yeah, like other speakers shared that like most of the delegates from developing countries were actually not satisfied with the amount. But at the same time, like we also need to think about not just quality, not just quantity, but also like the quality of this fund. Like even though like most of the developing country like wanted the finance to be like grant based because they have already have like accumulated debt from like other like development banks. So in that sense, just by giving them like more like loan based like monetary finance can actually mean like giving them more like burden, like financial burden to pay back. So that's something developing countries were actually like opposed, I would say. But yeah, that's something I can share.
Thank you. Kajsa, you have a quick reply on that, please.
Yeah, I realized I forgot to say two things more that I wanted to share about the decision, but also in response to Yuichi's point on like that it's not only the quantity, but also the quality of climate finance. I think that was a very important part of the discussion this year. And I'm very happy that we actually got several of those elements into the decision as well. So there's aspects there about how to enhance access to climate finance for those most vulnerable, such as small island states or the least developed countries. That was a crucial aspect in the negotiations that we really pushed from our side. But also that there's aspects there on not to only follow up on kind of the finance that has been given, but also on the results of that finance. What has it led to in terms of climate action on the ground to make sure that we actually use these money wisely? So I'm really happy about those elements in the decision, even though I think many countries would have wanted to see a lot more on the quality, like aspects of gender and human rights also included more clearly in the decision and on kind of the quality side. And then I also wanted to mention something that I realized that none of us spoke about, but that was actually kind of the key question with regards to this, is who should contribute to the goal. And it was a big discussion during the COP is which countries should help to contribute to this 300 goal. And in the end, the kind of end compromise is that it's clear that the developed countries should take the lead, but that others should follow. And there's a strong encouragement to developing countries that have the capacity to do so, to contribute. And I think that is a very kind of important part of this aspect, because who counts as a developed and developing country? Many people refer back to the list that was decided back when the climate convention was agreed on that it's only those that were developed back in 1992 that should contribute to this goal. But we know that today that some of the absolute richest countries in the world are not on that list. So we really wanted to see them also stepping up and being willing to contribute. And I really hope that this decision will enable that. So in that sense, we were going to be able to mobilize more money than previously.
Okay, I see you have a reply also, Yuichi. This is becoming a contested debate. Last quick thing before we move to the next question that actually relates to this as well.
Maybe like you're gonna cover like in the next question, but just to specify like some of the countries that are considered to have like more like capability to pay for like a finance, to contribute to the finance. For example, like under like UNFCCC, for example, like the China is considered as like developing countries. So at the end of the day, like based on the negotiation text, they are now like obligated to contribute to the climate finance, but their contribution is voluntary. So that's one of the maybe like maybe like that's one of the that's something like I also want to highlight.
Okay, good. I want to bring something here into the debate to move forward. I'm come from Colombia, one of the countries that is actually committing to phasing out fossil fuels. This was also one of the agitated items in the agenda. How come we want to pay to climate, but we also contribute subsidizing like oil explorations and expansion of carbon mines and stuff like that. So I also want to ask you again, with your happy faces, do you believe countries in the global north are genuinely committed to phasing out fossil fuels despite their continued investment in oil and gas? Okay, let's see. Okay, Christofer, you're happy. Okay, tell us why.
Well, I printed just one paper, so I have it on both sides.
Oh,
I wouldn't even be able to make both the faces at once, even if I wanted to. Well, that's what I get for trying to save paper. No, but I really do believe that most countries in the global north and especially in the European Union that we are genuinely committed to climate action, and this really includes through policy initiatives like the European Green Deal with the Fit for 55 policy package, but also now that we have, for example, the European climate law that is really putting our climate targets into law that we have to reach the climate targets, and that is really, it's not just about an voluntary pledge or something like that. It's something, it's actually embedded in law. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had the publication of the latest greenhouse gas emissions for the EU. With just in 2023, greenhouse gas emissions were reduced by 8%. And a part of this is also the kind of the EU trying to transition more towards renewables as a result of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. But also, if we're looking at a global level with statistics from the International Energy Agency, that also in 2023, $1.74 trillion went to clean energy, but only 1 trillion went to fossil fuels. So like still at a global level, more money is going to clean energy than fossil fuels. And this is a trend that we have seen for the last couple of years. So I think that really this transition towards renewable energy and clean energy, it's happening. It's perhaps not as fast as it should be, but it's definitely something that is now happening all over the world. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that this transition really takes time. One good example is coal, for an example, as you mentioned in Colombia, that in many European countries, if you just go back a couple of decades, coal would have seen as an impossibility to phase out. But at the same time, in September this year, the UK closed the Ratcliffe-on-Soar coal power plant, which was the last coal power plant for electricity. Similarly, in Spain, a country that I work with a lot, just a couple of decades ago, they had 45,000 people working in the coal industry. And next year, they're also going to close the last coal power plant. So it's a process that really takes a long time, but it's really about trying to see how do we work with trade unions to make sure that when these kind of fossil fuel plants close down, that it's not having a too high consequence for the workers. And I think it's really about developed countries in the global north also trying to learn from the mistakes of other policies in the past. For example, with in France, when President Macron tried to increase taxes on diesel, that led to the yellow jacket movement. So we need to make sure that when we're doing the transition, that we're doing it in a just and fair way. And that is why now that, for example, in the European Union, that we are trying to expand the use of the EU emission trading system, but we are also creating a social climate fund, so to try to provide financial assistance to the regions and the people that are the most vulnerable to the economic impacts. So it's a transition that is definitely happening, but we have become more careful when we design the policies to really make sure that it's not impacting the poorest in our societies.
thank you. Excellent. Kajsa, you were like ambivalent.
Yeah, but I think everything Christofer said is very true. And I do think that last year, all countries in the world, or all countries that are parts of the Paris Agreement, signed on to transitioning away from fossil fuels. And I think several of the countries that pushed for that agreement come from the global north. So I do think it's happening. Then you can always ask if it's happening fast enough. But of course, the aspect that Christofer is raising is crucial to think about. I also think the question can also be rethought to a sense, because I don't think the ones that are having the hardest time phasing out dependency on fossil fuels are necessarily in the north, even though a lot of the investments in fossil fuel also is there. So I think it's a kind of a problem we have across the globe, that we have a big momentum. We have a lot of people and countries transitioning, but we do have some governments over the world that are not as committed as others. And of course, that also varies over time. It depends on, in many countries where there is democracy, it depends on who you elect and who is currently the leader of that government. So it's also not a static picture of how the world looks. But I do think there is a positive but slow momentum. We know there's a huge gap between what the science says we should do and what is the current pledges and ambition levels from countries.
Thank you, Kajsa. Yuichi, what would you say? Like, what's the reality in Japan?
Like when trying to like answer this question, like I was thinking from like Japanese perspective, because like even though Japan is also like part of like G20, like G7, that like are supposed to like commit like phasing out from like fossil fuels, but up until like just like 2-3 years ago, like Japan was actually like investing money on like coal fire plant in like other Asian countries such as like Vietnam or like Bangladesh, and there was a huge backlash, and I think they stopped like investing money anymore. But like still, like when looking at like Japanese energy mix or the components or like where the energy is coming from, like still like 80% of like our energy is coming from like fossil fuels, and then we have like strong like I would say like in partnership with Australia, and where we like import most of the coal from Australia. So just given the geographic like situation, depends on like where you are. Even though like like as a global as a yeah like as a global scale, like we are trying to like phase out from like fossil fuels, but the reality is that like it's not actually happening like faster than it should be. Yeah, so that's something I can share from like Japan's perspective.
Thank you. And I think I wanted to move a little bit into the COP, back again to the actual day-to-day experience. And one of the things that impressed me the most was the amount and the number of civil society organizations that were there represented. You could see indigenous communities, people from all parts of the world, not only on the government side, but also on the civil society. And that was quite impressive. I myself study everyday forms of resistance to climate policies. It was interesting to see them trying to put their voices out there. So I want to ask you again with this, from your experience in the negotiation rooms, but also Juicy, from your experience of observing what was going on, do you think the voices of marginalized and indigenous communities were prioritized at COP29? Okay, we are unanimous, sad faces. Kajsa, maybe you want to start.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's several ways to think about this question, and I think most of them lead to a sad smiley. But I think if we would prioritize indigenous communities and marginalized communities, I do think we should have gotten a strong outcome on mitigation, on reducing emissions and actually doing more to combat climate change. And we didn't get that at this COP. So I think that is kind of perhaps the strongest way in which they weren't prioritized, or any vulnerable people on the planet was prioritized. Then also, there was a decision adopted on the local communities and indigenous peoples platform, which had its review this year. But we kind of finalized the negotiations on that already at another climate meeting in Bonn in June this year. So those negotiations were done when arriving to Baku, and I actually had the honor to kind of facilitate the negotiations on that agenda item. And I think now that we had finalized that already, we didn't have any negotiation track connected to indigenous peoples or local communities then, which meant that the attention to that topic wasn't as big as I have experienced it to be in other COPs. But then there was several events happening, talking about the role of indigenous peoples in climate action, also talking about the role of local communities in climate action. And there were several of those kind of events happening still at the COP. But my feeling was that it was less attention on that topic than it usually is on a COP.
Thank you. Christofer, what's your thought on that? Do the marginalized voices make it into the diplomats' rooms?
Yeah, I think it really depends from negotiation room to negotiation room, but overall from our side in the EU is always that we want to try to make as many of these negotiations open to observer organizations and civil society organizations as possible. And if you're ever at a COP and you participate in the first meeting on an agenda item that is being up for negotiations, then usually they say, does all the parties agree to having the meetings open to observers? And from our side in the EU, we always try to push for the meetings to be open, and that is also for indigenous communities and other local organizations. So this is definitely an area in general where we need to do more. And from our side in the EU, also what we do is, so for an example, with vulnerable countries, including least developed countries and small island developing states, then through the UNFCCC Secretariat, we provide financial aid so that some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries in the world can send climate negotiators to the COP. So we provide financial assistance for them to be able to buy the flight tickets, to be able to book hotels that can be outrageously expensive for the climate COP. Because if it wasn't for that kind of financial support, they would not be able to come. We also have some financial assistance also as part of that to make sure that there are more female climate negotiators coming from developing countries. But then beyond that, I mean, the good thing is that local communities and indigenous people, they are able to be a part of the UNFCCC process. So for example, there are different bodies under the UNFCCC that are called constituted bodies. So for example, the ones that I follow related to climate technologies, there we work really, really closely with indigenous people organizations, but also the women and gender constituency to try to get input from gender equality organizations on how can we make climate action more gender sensitive. And last point to mention as well is that we also try to bring local voices from the EU to the COP. So we also have organizations like the European Committee of the Regions, which is like mayors and local democratically elected representatives from the EU that also participate in the COP negotiations. So those are some of the things at least that we try to do to help out with this.
Thank you. Juichi, what's your take on this?
So as someone like who was just like walking around like different venues, trying to join like a different event organized by marginalized people, like either like indigenous, like group of like indigenous people, or like small island like state. Then they actually like had a place to share their like opinion and thought, but like it's not, I would say, like happening inside negotiation room, because I think like some of the speakers from those countries were saying that okay, like we actually have the space to share, to host this kind of event, but we don't really have like a right to observe like some of the core like negotiations, even though maybe some of the like meeting among like European unions are open to like other participants, but I would say like most of the important like core meetings are closed. So like one thing I can share to this event is that I think like one of the speakers from Brazil, I think like he was representing like one of the NGOs based in Brazil. I think like what he demanded for the COP study, like next year, which will be happening in Brazil. Like he was demanding for the co-presidency of the indigenous people with, just like a local presidency. So I think that's like a big like statement coming from a group of indigenous people that also like probably like represent that there's like lack of like inclusion, even though like I still like felt like okay, like many people are trying to be like as inclusive as possible, but when it comes to like bringing those people into like negotiation space, there's still like limitation.
Thank you. Well, time passed quickly, and we are approaching the last question formally before we start with the questions from the audience. So we start already receiving some interesting questions here that I will soon hand out to you. But I want to ask you one, and actually this is the question that most of our alumni and students from around the world ask us. And they want to ask you, what did you learn here at Lund University? What you did not learn? And what you wish you had learned that help you in your work in climate policies. So who feels strongest about this question? Kajsa, you look like you know what you learned and what you did not learn.
Yeah,
Please start.
I'm happy to start. And I think like I studied in Lund. I started in 2014 and I studied there until 2018, I think it was, or 19. So I think a lot has happened since then as well. But when I started off, because I was so determined that I wanted to work with climate change, I was looking like, what can I study with climate change? And at that time, when I applied, I didn't find anything at Lund University that had climate change as its kind of main topic to study. Now I know there's a lot of education you can and programs you can get that is climate focused, but at that time that wasn't the case. So I ended up studying like political science and economics, and I think that gave me a very good understanding of kind of how the world works and lots of the kind of the basic information about how society functions and how different models of thinking about it. But I remember like constantly trying to focus all my essays and assignments on climate change, kind of trying to force that myself. And then, so I think I learned a lot of like how climate change can come into everything, even though that might not be the topic that you're discussing primarily. And then when I studied engineering for 1 year, I studied ecosystem technique, I guess it would be called in English. And I think that gave me a really good kind of more natural science and scientific base on climate change and on environmental aspects in general, and really kind of that basic understanding, which I think has been super useful. I think that is what I take with me the most from my studies. But then what I want to emphasize the most is that the things that I learned the most, that I have the most kind of use of today, is things I learned by being engaged in societies during my time at Lund University. I was very active in the Association of Foreign Affairs in UPF, and I think I learned so much from the different lectures there, from being a part of the different the board and the different kind of committees. Just learned on so many different aspects about how the world works, how you collaborate with each other, how you produce things together, and how you kind of how your own involvement and engagement can actually produce results. So I think that is the kind of what I learned the most, and it's actually through that engagement that I got first the role as a youth delegate in the Swedish delegation to the COP. So, or actually first I went there for the organization just to report for the newspaper for my first COP. And then for my second COP was as a youth delegate in the Swedish delegation. And I was nominated through that organization then. So I think Lund University gave me a lot when it comes to getting this job, and lots of new, useful kind of knowledge and skills. But I think that most comes from kind of the social parts outside of the actual studies, and a little bit less from the actual academic work.
Thank you. And I can assure you that things have changed. We even have a new master program starts next year on climate change and society, if I can do some advertisement for that.
Very good.
You're right, that things, I mean, it comes slowly, and I think this is a message for many other universities around the world, but also good message for the students that are listening to us about the importance of engaging in other means, that you don't have to participate at the COP as an official United Nations delegate, but you can also do it as a student. What about you, Christofer? If you briefly can tell us.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I studied in Lund from 2011 to 2014, and I think in terms of what I learned, I had a really good course on Introduction to Environmental Policy, and all these years later, I still have the course book from when I studied, and I think still it's one of the best courses that I had at university, because it was really like one chapter on the ozone hole, why that's a problem, one chapter on acidification and why that is a problem. So that is something that has really helped me develop more about holistic understanding of sustainability beyond just climate change. Beyond that, I also had a class on environmental law, like Swedish environmental law, and really that understanding of how laws are created and implemented has been really useful in my job now in the EU, of understanding that really like the law is so important, and if you can change the law, you can really change of how a society works. Then in terms of maybe not what I didn't learn in Lund, but a thing that I instead learned when I was an exchange student. So I studied 1 year at University of California, Berkeley, and then I had a class in international environmental politics, and we did like a model UN role playing for a couple of classes where everyone was representing different countries, and it was really interesting to see like students that had never been to India ever before, but they were representing India in this model UN, and they were really starting to act the way that India is actually interacting in the UNFCCC process. And I think me and all the other students really got a very good understanding of why countries act the way they do, and the different arguments that can be used to try to change and find compromises in a UN system where everything is based on consensus. So that was also a really useful class that I often think back to.
Thank you. Juichi, you were the ones that graduated last, I think. So you've been most recently here in Lund. What do you recommend? Like, what did you learn?
The same as other speakers, I would say like I have gained like a lot of like knowledge about like sustainability challenges and how complex like everything is, and also at the same time like how everything is interconnected. And at the same time, like what my program also have emphasized is the importance of like interdisciplinarity in addressing the climate change, because you won't be able to like solve like complex issue like climate change only by like one single like discipline. So you actually need to collaborate not only with in your own like discipline, but also from like other disciplines. But it shouldn't like stay like only within academia as well. There should be like a collaboration with like non-state actors as well. So it could be, you know, like people on the ground, or could be like with like different like organizations, or could be with like policymakers. So these kind of like different like layers of actors, and also like uniting those like different actors are key in fostering I would say like climate policies. And what I wanted to run from, it doesn't have to be from Lund, but like, you know, just something like I wanted to learn before I actually go to COP, but similar to what Christopher mentions. After just like interacting with like several like youth delegate, some of the young participants have experienced something called like mock COP. So it's basically like same mechanism as like mock UN, just, you know, just assigning the topics of the COPs, and just, you know, dividing like students into like different like nations so that they represent like different countries, and then actually like do like mock like negotiations. So that's the kind of like experience is something I wish I could have before I go to COP.
Thank you. And I agree with you. I think more experience-based knowledge and learning will be good also for Lund University. We're moving into the questions from the audience, and I'm gonna think that not all of you to answer all the questions because we would not have time. So here I want you to raise your card if you want to answer that question and come with your, how do you say, power. So we have one question from Sin and studied Loomis here at Lund University, and said many countries are shifting focus from environmental aspects to new technologies like artificial intelligence, but also to security. Do you think we can still achieve the climate goals to support developing countries? Christofer, go ahead.
I think it's a really relevant question, but I think it connects a little bit to what I mentioned before with the statistics from the International Energy Agency, that we're really seeing all countries in the world essentially at this point trying to find ways to attract investments in clean technology, and that now it's a much more progressive and pragmatic discussion on how to actually have the infrastructure investments to enable electrification, also battery factories and so on. So I think that the question of energy security or security is not necessarily something that is impossible to combine with a wider sustainability discussion. And from our side in the European Union, that now following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that in the last 2 years, we have installed renewable energy capacity that is the equivalent for the entire capacity of Germany in just 2 years. And that is because renewable energy provides a completely different energy security for the EU than importing fossil fuels. But it's definitely something that takes time, and we need to see like not only these investments in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And there are different ways of doing that, including through the provision of grants and public climate finance to developing countries. But we also have different private sector, private finance initiatives. In one example in the EU is the EU taxonomy on sustainable financial activities. So how can you make it as easy as possible for investors, for the private sector to know what company is green, what kind of financial activity is green, so that if you are going to a bank and say you want to invest in a green company, that there are criteria that defines what is a green investment, so that money can flow to the right place. But so I think they are definitely not at odds, but can be combined.
Mhm. We need to combine, that's
Yeah.
true. And hopefully securitization will not take over because we need to have climate action. We have another question from Kim. And the question is, what are your thoughts on the COP as an organization allowing 1,700 fossil fuel lobbyists to the conference, actively trying to water down the goals and negotiations? Anyone feels like answering? Kajsa, go ahead. You answer, but with a sad face.
That was the one lying on top. No, I do think it is problematic that we have such a high presence of those kind of trying to counteract the outcomes of the conference. I am happy that we also have a strong presence of civil society actors at the COPs trying to do the opposite. And it's really hard actually to get to the bottom with this type of representation. There's been discussions on kind of conflicts of interests and who you can nominate to your delegation, etc. So I do think it's an issue that we need to discuss, and it's an issue that has to be taken seriously. But I think it's also important to continue emphasizing the importance of having the COPs inclusive. And kind of the second you start saying to some people that they can't join, others will want to say to others that they can't join. So it's a fine balance to find, but it's indeed a bit problematic. And I don't have a solution to it, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's true, but it was, as you said, also interesting that there is the other side of the organizations doing the counterbalance, as that we need to see both. We have another question. Brigitta, she asked, how can the old definition of developing country be changed so that all the large economies like China can contribute to finance the climate change in poorer countries? Who wants to answer? Okay. Kajsa, go ahead.
Excellent question, I think. And actually, the definition has changed to an extent. Under the Kyoto Protocol, there was a list of countries annexed to the Kyoto Protocol saying who is defined as developed and who is defined as developing. But if you look at the Paris Agreement, there is no such list of countries. So we still talk about developed and developing countries, but there is actually no list of countries. Then some countries argue, especially those that kind of might be the ones that we would want to add to the developed countries list, argue that we still should use the kind of annexes from the Kyoto Protocol in the discussions also under the Paris Agreement. But that was a huge win with the Paris Agreement, that there is no defined list of who is developed and who is developing. All the countries that were developed under the Kyoto Protocol still say we're fine, we're still developed under the Paris Agreement, but we want others to join because the situation has changed. And actually also, I think one thing that we can have a look at is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities that is in the Climate Convention, but also enshrined in the Paris Agreement, but then it's kind of expanded, so it's in light of national capacities and respective capabilities. So, and I think looking at that, it's clear that this should be dynamic. What you contribute to the Paris Agreement, both in terms of your own climate action in your country and emission reductions, but also in terms of finance to others, should reflect your country's own kind of responsibility, but also your capabilities and your national circumstances. So I think trying to like argue based on that, I think is a way to change it. And also just very brave countries that were on the developing list before to step up and say, okay, we're fine to start contributing or to redefine ourselves. And just a last point is that now in the decision on the finance goal, it clearly states that who contributes to the climate goal, it won't change your status as developed or developing country. So you can remain a developing country if that's important to you, but you can still contribute to the goal financially.
Okay, wow, will give for a new lecture and class, of course, at Lund University, Development Studies there. We have many more questions and only 3 minutes left. So Maximilian asked about the carbon markets. Like, do these carbon markets, are they the solution? Okay, Christofer.
No, Joshi, please go ahead.
Joshi, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not expert on this like carbon market, but I have been like following some like studies that says that actually the carbon market is actually not contributing much in terms of like reducing like overall like emissions. So even though like one of the topics of the COP29 was adoption of Article 6 of Paris Agreement, which was basically about like carbon trading and carbon credit. So there's I would say like the both side. Okay, like just by like adopting carbon market can also like accelerate the development of I would say like a green technology, like like CCS, that is also considered as somewhat controversial. So there's also like a divided opinion. So yeah, maybe I will just pass to Christofer to elaborate further.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's really to remember that carbon markets could be one way to try to transfer some climate finance to developing countries. But from our side in the EU, we've been really cautious to see that we don't want there to be middle income countries, for example, in Gulf countries, that are using carbon markets as a way of not taking ambitious climate action at the expense of really developing countries with the rainforests, for example, in Africa and Latin America. So as part of these negotiations on Article 6, we really wanted to ensure that there's a robust accounting system for carbon markets so that it doesn't become a loophole that will enable some countries to not take ambitious climate actions. Because for us, the most important thing is to really reduce emissions and mitigate emissions where it's possible, and provide support to developing countries for adaptation and mitigation. But that carbon markets is a part of the solution, but that it shouldn't be used as a loophole by some countries.
Okay, and now we're 1 minute before the end of this wonderful panel, and I want to thank you all for participating, also to our wonderful audience for being here. And I want to ask you in 30 seconds to tell the audience what's still hopeful for these global efforts to have climate action. So where does your hope comes from? Kajsa, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Know that the world comes together every year and manages to agree that we should do more on climate change. And there's none of the countries that are there that denies that we need to do more, that denies that we should keep to the 1.5 degree target, that we every year can come and kind of reaffirm those things. I think that really gives me hope.
Thank you. Juicy, what gives you hope?
So having a space like a COP where like the delegates from like all countries come together and discuss like what we can do to mitigate impact of climate change. Like having a space itself is like something like we should appreciate. And that also gives me a hope.
Thank you. Christofer.
Indeed, I think really even though from the outside it can seem like the whole COP process and UNFCCC that it's very slow, I think it's really important to keep in mind that this is the biggest challenge of our generation, and that is really, we have a place where all the countries of the world and different civil society organizations are coming together to talk about this. And just that to begin with is really is something beautiful at the same time, like in the same way that the European Union was created after the Second World War as a way of ensuring peace in Europe. It's the same thing for the whole UNFCCC process of countries working together to solve this challenge. So I think that instills a lot of hope for me, and that you get to work and meet people from all over the world, and in the end you have the same goal that you're working towards.
Thank you. Well, I'm a believer of democracy. I'm a believer of the everyday citizen. Those of you that join us in this panel, you are probably far away from the COP meeting, but you are the COP as well, because over there is your political representatives that are there. So hopefully we can influence politics from where we are, and we can all contribute in a different way to solve this climate crisis together. Thanks so much for being here, and I hope that you enjoy the panel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.